Set up. First of all, good evening, everyone. Are you able to see these papers behind me? Are you able to read them? All right, good. I won't tell you how much time I spent on them. Anyways, so I see, good evening, everyone. I see someone all the way from El Segundo. You know who you are. We're a day before Matan Torah. We're about to get ready to receive the Torah, to make ourselves a proper vessel for their receiving of the Torah. And, you know, it's one of those times where we want to reflect. We want to become a better person. We want to undo our wrongs. We want to take on new resolutions, and as we well should. And the question becomes, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylos. Wait, is that the wrong holiday? Why is this year different than all other years? Why this time, when I try to correct my mistakes, will it actually work? You know, last time I made a resolution, I decided this, I decided that, and, you know, 1, 2, skip a few, and I'm back to square one. So how do we make change? How do we learn from our mistakes and not repeat them, you know, a day or two later or a year later? How do we make an indelible change? So to learn the answer to that question, we're going to explore some of the text that is discussed and mentioned in regards to the giving of the Torah. And as I'm sure many of you know, the giving of the Torah was a theatrical experience. It was amazing what was going on. And the Torah relates so many details, each of which so much can be learned from. So, you know, when the Jewish people left Egypt, this was the climax that they were looking forward to. When God met Moses at the burning bush, he says, you know, you're gonna take these Jewish people out of Egypt, and they're gonna worship me on this mountain. They're gonna worship me you're gonna receive the Torah on Mount Sinai. And the Jewish people finally, 6 weeks after they complete their exodus from Egypt, and all the Egyptians drown in the sea, they finally make it to Mount Sinai, and they're very excited. They set up camp. They established their dwelling place there. There was no major instructions, no announcements over the PA system on the first day that they arrived. But the second day, they were told, listen here, guys, you know, you are actually first gals and then guys. The women were spoken to first. But anyways, God tells the Jewish people, you are my kingdom of priests. You're going to be a shining star. You're going to be if I can borrow a phrase, the shining city on a hill. You're going to show everyone what it means to live a life led by God. And the Jewish people responded with the famous words, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear. We don't know what's coming. We don't know what kind of commandments we're going to be told, but we know we are ready. And after the Jews told this to Moses and said, we will do, and then we will listen, Moses goes up to the mountain, and he relays the response of the Jewish people to Hashem. So let's look at text 1 in your books. If you have the student book, it's on page 110. If you have the PDF, it's on one of the first few pages. Maybe Rabbi Zushi can post the link again for those who just joined. And the verse reads like this. This is from Exodus chapter 19, verse 9. And God said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in the thickness of the cloud, in order that the people hear when I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever. Okay, that's end quote of what God said. And Moses relayed the words of the people to God. Okay, so basically, The Jews are meant to act as an example. Oh, very good. We have it on the screen. Even better. The Jews are meant to act as an example of God's chosen people, and the Jews will merit this great revelation of God, reciting the Ten Commandments to Moshe, and the Jews would actually be able to hear God's voice. Now, the Talmud in Tractate Shabbos, which discusses the whole back and forth and details of what happened, the exchange that went on, says, something over here is a little unclear. What exactly did the Jewish people tell God? What was the sequence of the conversation? So the Talmud here asks in text 2a, what did God tell Moses? And what did Moses relate to the Jews? What was the Jewish reply to Moses, and what did Moses relate to God? So the Talmud answers, this concerns the mitzvah of fencing off the mountain. And where do we see this mitzvah? Where do we see this mitzvah that God tells the Jewish people that the mountain has to be fenced off? So look at text 2b. This is only 3 verses later from the earlier text. And you shall set boundaries for the people around the mountain, saying, beware of ascending the mountain or touching its edge. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. Okay? So it's a very clear instruction that the Jews have to create a fence around the mountain. So basically the sequence was, first, the Jews said, Na'aseh v'nishma. They said, we will do, and then we will listen. And then God says, okay, now I want you to, in preparation for this momentous occasion, I want you to fence off the mountain. Now, and basically, God also tells them, I'm gonna be announcing the Ten Commandments. But the Jews, instead of saying, oh wow, we get to hear God's voice, they were unsatisfied. They wanted more. They wanted a better deal. So this is where I go over here. What they were looking for was to be able to see God. They wanted more than just to be able to hear God's voice. They wanted to be able to see God. So this is what the Jewish people told Moses to relay back to God in text 3. What did the Jews tell Moses to relate to God? It is our desire to see our king. In Hebrew, that's Ritzonenu lirot et malkeinu. We want to see him. We don't want to just hear about him. How can you compare hearing to seeing, right? So this is the part of the conversation that was left out in the actual text in the book of Exodus. But the Medrash and the commentaries fill us in on the background of this conversation, that the Jews were asking to see God, and God says, "Listen, I'm just coming in the cloud, and Moses will see me, but you'll just hear me." Now the question is, what were the Jews looking for? What was the objective? Why did they want to see godliness? What wasn't enough about hearing God's voice? And if you think about it, the point was they should hear the commandments, they should gather the information, perhaps write it down, document it, and make sure that they actually fulfill it. It's nice to see God, but is that necessary? Is that the purpose of all this? Or is the purpose to receive and retain the information that's being transmitted? And it seems almost like a selfish desire to want to experience this godly revelation. Now, we'll get to the answer to this question a little later on, but just first of all, as a matter of fact, if you look in text 4a, you'll see that God actually granted their request. Look what it says. And God said to Moses, "Go to the people and prepare them today and tomorrow, and they should wash their garments. And they should prepare for the third day, for on the third day God will descend before the eyes of all the people upon Mount Sinai." Okay, so God says, you want to see me? Granted, I will reveal myself to you. Your eyes will actually be able to visualize me. But this is a step higher. It's a greater revelation. You need to be adequately prepared. And so therefore, you got to go to the mikveh, you got to immerse yourselves, your clothing. You also need to create a separation. Husband and wives were not allowed to engage in marital relations for 3 days before. And also, it's a time for introspection. It's a time for meditation and to realize the awesome experience and revelation that we're about to go through. So this was the instructions that God gave, especially considering that this was the most exciting and dramatic moment of all of history. And sure enough, day 3 arrives. The grand revelation is here. And how does it present itself? With a frightening bang. Text 4b, it came to pass on the morning of the 3rd day, there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very powerful blast of a shofar, and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. Now, if you think about this description, you could just imagine this was an awesome, tremendous, dramatic event, and you can see why the people trembled in fear, right? But if you think about the objective over here, it's a little strange that it'll be such a fearful experience, right? Sinai was supposed to be an expression of God's love to the Jewish people, his intimate connection with them, not some frightening scare where everybody's, just shuddered out of their place. And to prove this idea that Sinai was meant to be and was indeed, although right now it doesn't seem that way, Sinai was a loving experience, an intimate relation between God and the Jewish people. King Solomon, in his book of Song of Songs, reflects on that. Look at text 5a. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Where what basically King Solomon is expressing over here is that the Jewish people want God's kiss of the mouth, just like they experienced at Mount Sinai. Rashi over there comments. Rashi's the 11th century most well-known commentary on the Torah. So he explains, what does this mean? 5b, she, the Jewish people that is, recites the song with her mouth, in her exile and in her widowhood. If only King Solomon would kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, as he did in the days of old. In some places they kiss on the back of the hand or on the shoulder, but I desire and wish that he behaved toward me as he behaved toward me originally, like a bridegroom to a bride, mouth to mouth. So just to understand, the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, was written by King Solomon as a metaphor, as a euphemism for the relationship of the Jewish people and God Almighty. And it uses the metaphors of a husband and wife. And what this verse that we quoted in 5a is saying, that the Jewish people wishes that King Solomon, so to speak, meaning not King Solomon, but the King of Kings, God Almighty, shall kiss me like he kissed me back at Sinai, mouth to mouth. It was an intimate, loving relationship. But normally speaking, a kiss, an intimate kiss, doesn't lead to a feeling of fear, right? Look at my feelings chart over here. Was it a loving feeling? Was it a loving experience? Or was it a frightening one, a fearful one? And speaking of fear and the fearful experience or the fearful symptoms, shall I say, of this loving experience, look at text 6a, also from the Sinai Experience. And all the people saw the voices and the flames, the sound of the shofar, and the smoking mountain. And the people saw and trembled, and they stood from afar. So you could think that, the people saw this frightening experience, and they took a step back, like nowadays we're told to take a step back, socially distanced, right? They didn't want to be harmed by God's revelation and awesome holiness, so they voluntarily took a step back. Says the Talmud, no. They didn't voluntarily step back. This was, in fact, a dramatic experience. You might have heard about this. Look at text 6b. Rabbi Yehoshua, the son of Levi, said, the souls of the Jewish people expired at each sentence uttered by God. As the verse states, my soul went out as he spoke, meaning he, the capital H, God. If their souls expired at the first commandment, how did they receive the second commandment? So before I read further, I just want to give a little background. It says that the first two commandments were given by God Almighty. The Jews were actually able to hear God's voice. Don't ask me what that sounds like. I don't remember. But after those first two commandments, the Jewish people said, "Oh, this is too much for us. Moses, you're on a different level. You take this one on and just report back to us. Let us know what you hear." So the first two commandments the Jewish people heard from God Almighty, namely the one of I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And the rest, the other 8 of the 10 commandments, Moses heard from God and transmitted to the Jewish people. So back to text 6b, what we're saying here is that their souls perished. They perished. Their souls left their bodies after the first one, but yet somehow they got it back with the second one. How did that happen? So the Talmud continues, God revived them with the dew that he will use to resurrect the dead in the Messianic era. As the verse states, generous rain you poured down, O God, your heritage, which was weary, you firmed up. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said further, with each sentence uttered by God, the Jews shrank back a distance of 12 mil. A mil takes about 18 minutes to walk. So let's say a mile. They shrank back 12 miles, and the ministering angels led them back. Okay, so this was a dramatic experience. Speaking of love or fear, I mean, this was not just trembling. This was beyond that. They literally flew backwards. Over here, the reaction to the commandments was not just trembling. I don't know if you could see that hand over here, trembling, but as you can see, that gentleman flying backwards. Now, nothing about this sounds very loving. Furthermore, the question is, if you look at text 4b, we said that they trembled, but yet in text 6a, we said that they went from afar. They literally moved backwards. So we have to figure out what exactly happened. Did they just tremble? Did they fling backwards? What happened? Also, what's interesting is that even though God told Moses to tell the Jewish people that they need to fence off the mountain, and this was 3 days before the giving of the Torah and the 10 Commandments, but right before the presentation of the 10 Commandments, God repeats the instruction and says, remember, don't touch the mountain. Don't go up to the mountain. So you see there's this repetition, which seems superfluous considering that the Jews were already told not to touch the mountain. In fact, they built a fence around it. I mean, what kind of better reminder do you need than a physical fence right in front of you? So let's talk about the difference between hearing and seeing. Let's just first recap everything that we talked about. We talked about how there was a request of the Jewish people to see God and not just to hear him. There seems to be a feeling of fear and not a very loving feeling between the Jewish people. There seems to be a contradiction between two verses, one which said that they trembled, another one which said that they flung backward, and then this seeming superfluous mention of not ascending the mountain. So to answer the third point about trembling versus moving back, what happened actually was that when the Jewish people saw God, that was a much more changing experience. it changed them in such a way that when they saw godliness, when they saw God revealed himself through the cloud, that caused them literally to fly backwards. And we'll see this, we'll go a little bit deeper into the difference between seeing and hearing. We'll start with the following reading in text 7a. Hearing isn't seeing. So it is a popular notion that hearing and seeing are different from one another. Listening occurs when sound vibrations enter and strike the ear, which represents the speaker drawing close to the listener, right? There are sound waves coming from whoever is talking into my ear. Seeing is the opposite. Seeing occurs when I project my line of sight onto the item. Therefore, when Simon hears Reuven's voice, Reuven is drawing close to Simon because Reuven is the speaker. When Simon sees Reuven, Simon is drawing near to Reuven. So in other words, seeing is a more active experience, right? You need to actually open your eyes in order to see, right? You're projecting your. I'm not a scientist, but I remember reading once that your eyes contain within them each color, and from within them they sort of project onto whatever items you're looking at. It's a more active experience. Your eyes are doing something. But simply put, you have to open your eyes in order to perform the act of seeing. To hear, it happens automatically. You could hear in your sleep. They say even dead people are able to hear before they're put 6 feet under, but you got to watch what you say around the dead person because they could hear you. So hearing doesn't require much activity, but seeing, that's something that requires you to be more engaged. A second difference between seeing and hearing is on the impact it makes on you. When you hear about something, it could be a nice piece of news or a negative piece of news, and it's fairly irrelevant in your life. But when you see it, when you can visualize it, that's a whole different experience. So say, for example, in January of this year, many of us might have heard of some virus going around China. Okay, something out there. I'm hearing reports. Did we do anything? Most of us? No, it was something far away. But then it starts coming and you hear that your friend's neighbor got sick, right? You see a family member, your uncle is in the hospital, in my case. It becomes a lot more real because you see it. It's not just something you hear about from far away. And so when we see something, it creates a much deeper imprint upon us. Let's look at how the Rebbe explains this in text 7b. What we see reaches deeper into our soul and is therefore accepted with more conviction than what we hear. When we see something with our own eyes, we know it with a certainty, and no logical argument can convince us that we are wrong, because the clarity of sight reaches much deeper and provides much more conviction than clarity gained by logic. Conversely, hearing does not reach as deeply into our soul and is not as indelibly engraved into the soul. Right? So if you saw a solar eclipse with your own eyes, there would be no amount of logical persuasion that would tell you, there was actually no solar eclipse. It didn't happen. What do you mean? I saw it with my own eyes. But if somebody told you that they saw a solar eclipse, somebody else can convince you that it didn't really happen, right? Because you only heard about it. So there's really two differences between seeing and hearing. One is that seeing requires more of an investment on your part. You're exercising more muscles than by hearing. And number two, seeing creates a greater sense of conviction and creates a greater impression upon us. And the truth is, that one is hinged upon the other, that because we are more invested, because we're doing more to be able to see something, therefore it causes also that it creates an actual impact upon us. And so now let's use these points about seeing and hearing to our spiritual experience in godly terms. If you hear something from God, and God bless us, we should act, if only we could hear God's voice, right? But if you hear something from God, it is possible that you could remain unaffected. Yes, it might be a remarkable experience. It might be noteworthy. It might be something you'd want to share with your grandkids. You know, God spoke to me, right? But it's possible that it won't be life-changing. But if you were to see God with your very own flesh of your eyes, if you saw God, that would be something that would stay with you forever. It's impossible that it won't leave its mark upon you. And so therefore, when you hear something, you don't necessarily change as a person. It's information. It's something that could inform a future decision, but it doesn't necessarily change you as a person. When you see something, it changes you completely. When you see a horrible event happen in front of your eyes, it's indescribable. Somebody who went through the Holocaust and saw the torture and the horrors that went on then, it leaves a mark like none other. You could read about it, you could watch a movie. Even watching a movie, it's sort of a in between, but it's essentially the idea of hearing about it. It leaves a mark, but not like when you experienced it yourself. So when the Jewish people were saying, we want to see God, it's that they want to have that indelible mark of godliness upon them. Let's talk about two characters in biblical history that had different relationships between God, both of whom were prophets. If you look on page 118, you'll see Balaam versus Moses, right? So let's read about them. Who was Balaam, or Bilam in Hebrew? He was an arrogant fellow, egotistical. He communicated with God. In fact, Balak, the king of Moab, appointed Bilam to curse the Jewish people. Mind you, that failed, but anyways, that's for another story. But Bilam remained an unchanged person. He remained the same evil person he was, even though he communicated with God, even though he heard from God. Moses, however, went through a deep transformation in his communication with God. Why? Because he saw godliness. Let's look at text 8a. Every time God communicated with Moses, whether it was a speech, a saying, or a commandment, he first called to Moses by name, which is a communication of affection. As the verse states, the ministering angels call to one another. It says, V'kara zeh el zeh, they call out. However, to the non-Jewish prophets, God revealed himself through expressions denoting coincidence and impurity. As the verse states, and God chanced, Vayikar Elikim el Bilam. God chanced upon Bilam. So God's conversation with the Gentile prophets was that of a coincidence. He happened to communicate with him. Some information, some wave of communication happened to transpire between God and this said individual. But with Moses, with the Jewish prophets, there's this Vayikra. He's calling to him, like when a loved one calls somebody they love, they call to them, they bring them closer, and that's the type of communication that Moses had with God. And it's this type of communication that opens the heart and makes it conducive to real change. Now, just like the Jewish people were were told to prepare themselves to communicate with God, to receive the Ten Commandments, Moses was also told to prepare himself before communicating with God. Look at text 8b. The previous verse states, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested upon it and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. A cloud resting upon the tabernacle denotes a presence of God's endless light that stems from a transcendental and awesome place. It therefore says, and he called to Moses, which means that he empowered Moses to ascend and to enter the tent of meeting. Meaning to say that when God calls upon you, it gives you the ability to engage. It gives you the ability to connect to God. And that's why we see that Moses couldn't enter the tabernacle before God called to him, because that's what brought him close. Whereas Bilam, who just had God chancing upon him, that didn't allow him to change. Let's look at text 8c, which continues this thought. Vayikar, which was said to Bilam, implies that God addressed Bilam as he was, in his lowly state. Not so the Vayikra that was said to Moses, which was a summons to draw closer to God and to be elevated by the prophecy. So you can say that the difference between Vayikar and Vayikra, the difference between being chanced upon and being summoned, being called upon, is that being chanced upon is sort of like Shmiya, it's like hearing. It comes to you. It's like when you hear something, it lands. It comes to you. You didn't have to do anything. Just by virtue of you existing, you hear it. But when you see something, you have to exercise a certain muscle. There's a certain closeness. You are coming close to the person you're looking at. So now let's go back to the conversation of the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai. So in the beginning, when the Jews arrived at Mount Sinai, they agreed to hear, right? They said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. They said, we're ready to hear the 10 Commandments. They're like, God, I trust you have some valuable information to share with us, and I'd like to hear it, but we're not yet ready to change. Let's hear what you have to offer, and we'll take it from there. And yes, we're willing to do it. True, they did say we will do it, but it wasn't to a point of they were ready to change themselves. Okay, I'll check off the box. You want me to do X, Y, and Z? I'll do X, Y, and Z. But they weren't prepared to change. Later on, however, as they got closer to the grand day, that's when they asked to see God. Because that's when they would strive to bridge the gap between infinity, between God Almighty, the gap between infinity and a mortal human being. And at this point, they're already desiring a deeper relationship with God Almighty. So, it's not that we have a right to demand that we experience this transcendence, that we experience this connection to God, which is obviously something that goes beyond ourselves. But it's something we can request from God. And if God chooses to empower us to connect to him, to show us his love, to show his connection to us, that's the only way it can happen. But the truth is, like every relationship, it goes two ways. God, on the one hand, has to empower us to be able to connect to him in such a transcendent way, meaning that we transcend ourselves and our normal egos, etc. But we also have to do something on our part. And that's why we have to change our attitude. We have to do, the Jewish people were commanded to go to immerse themselves in water, to separate, to meditate. They had to go through a certain change in order to be ready for this monumental occasion. because here they were about to enter a state of seeing, of doing something, not just being chanced upon by spirituality, by godliness. Now, let us go ahead to text 10. Where at this point, we'll be able to answer a lot of the questions that we asked earlier about what the Jews were trying to accomplish with seeing. What was this a loving experience or a frightening experience? Did they tremble? Did they fall back? Why is God repeating himself? Hopefully now we can answer all these questions. So we asked why the Jewish people needed to see God. And that's something that by now I'm pretty sure we've answered quite well. And that is, they wanted to go through a transformation. They desired to connect to God in a way that'll transform them. They wanted to create an indelible mark upon themselves. And that's something that could only happen with seeing as opposed to just hearing. Let's look at text 10. Perhaps the desire to see God was prompted by God's instruction to fence off the mountain. They understood that they would be unable to stand closer to God, but would need to stand back at a distance. But they asked that at the very least they be permitted to see God, because seeing God would enable them to be at least somewhat attached to God. So basically the Jews didn't want the commandments to just chance upon them, sort of like the Beleiving experience where, they remain unaffected, but they wanted that the commandments should be indelibly engraved into their souls. That's why they asked to see God. We could also now understand the difference of why in one verse it says that they trembled, and in another verse it says that they actually flung backwards. Because one was before they saw God, and one was afterwards. Let's look at text 11. We can now understand why they did not shrink back and stand at a distance before they received the Ten Commandments. At this point, they were still unable to see. They could only hear. This means that they had not yet established an internal connection with God. Therefore, they did not shrink back and did not stand at a distance. They merely trembled. However, the next verse, which reads, "And all the people saw," describes the state of the people after they were elevated to see God and thus had formed a connection with God. This is why they shrank back and stood from afar. Even after 3 days of preparation, which conditioned them somewhat for this connection, they, as mere mortals, were unable to withstand their connection with the Supreme. So however much we prepare ourselves, however much we strive to connect with godliness, and however softly God reaches down to us and gives us a hand and calls to us, brings us close, we're still light years away from ever being able to relate to God directly, right? I mean, God's infinite, we're finite. That's the greatest disparity there could ever be between two things. And therefore, when these two things collided, when godliness, seeing God in a human body with their own flesh of their eyes, when that occurred, it forced them to shrink back, and to the point that their souls expired. They literally passed away. Now we could understand why, even though King Solomon describes the Sinai experience as a loving one that's a kissing of mouth to mouth, the most intimate expression of love, how that can cause symptoms of fear. Why? Because no matter how loving, how soft God makes his approach, when God comes close to us, when God brings us close to him, when the divine and the mundane connect, it's a mind-blowing experience. And it causes those symptoms of fear, in that the two things get distance from one another. They grow apart. They can't coexist, because such a tremendous revelation of godliness cannot attach itself in a real way naturally to a human being. Just to give you an example, imagine you met, I don't know, who's your greatest hero in human history? You met Abraham Lincoln, or you met the Roman Caesar, the Roman emperor, or you met Moses, you met King David, somebody that, you always looked up to and spoke about and read every book that they wrote and knew everything about them. And then suddenly you get to meet them person to person. And while you're there in the crowd, in the same room as that tremendous figure, let's say we're talking about Moses. Moses puts his arm around you and says, Chaim Yankel, how you doing? Stacy, well, how's your day doing? What have you been up to? What do you eat for lunch? You tremble. Even though he's showing you love, he's showing you connection and affection, you'd feel tongue-tied. You wouldn't be able to speak. And that's sort of the experience. Imagine that multiple times over. When God's coming and expressing love to the Jewish people, it causes them to tremble. It causes them to fly back, because, wow, God's speaking to me. I never thought this would happen, right? So this explains why a loving experience causes symptoms of fear, causes distance. Now, to answer our last question about the repetition of the warning of not going up on the mountain, the answer to this will also flow from the fact that the Jews now had permission to see God. Moses was the only one who went up on the mountain, right? We all know that. Moses went up on the mountain alone. There was a fence around, and nobody else was allowed to ascend the mountain. However, this was something that they were told before they saw God. This was something they were told 3 days prior. They were told, you're going to hear the 10 Commandments, but you need to make a fence because Moses will go up. You won't go up. But the Jewish people thought, why do I need a fence? Because I'm only going to hear God. And Moses is going to see God. Okay, so I understand there's a disparity. There's a difference between Moses and between me. But now that we know that God is granting our request and we're actually going to be able to see him, perhaps we, just like Moses, should go up on the mountain to experience God in his full glory. So that's why God had to give it. No. Guys, stay in your lane. They might have thought that they could stand with Moses right there up on the mountain, and God had to enlighten them and ensure, no, Moses goes up on the mountain, you don't go up on the mountain. That's why there's a second warning. Look at text 12. God understood that Jews might come to rationalize stepping onto the mountain. Inasmuch as the instruction to fence off the mountain was given prior to the 3 days of preparation to see God, they might rationalize that once they were conditioned to see God, they might also be able to draw closer to God and stand on the mountain proper. Thus, they needed to be reminded again, just before the 10 Commandments were given, that though they could now see God, it was merely a slight connection with God, not a complete connection. So what we have here is really 4 different levels of connection of God. Oh, you have it here on the screen. Thank you. Number 1 is it can feel entirely coincidental and unimportant, as it did to Bilam. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, God spoke to me yesterday. Yeah, let me check my caller my caller ID. I have a call from recent 626 number, a 213 Shimon. Oh God, yeah, I spoke to him earlier today. No big deal, right? That's how Bilam communicated with God. Level 2 is it can be heard, causing fearful trembling, but we remain in place. And that's what the Jews were prepared to do as soon as they arrived at Mount Sinai, before they made any requests and had a whole conversation with God via Moses. Then there's level C. It can be seen, as our ancestors saw at Sinai, in which case they were impacted deeply and were thrown back, but still could not get past the fence, right? So, I mean, seeing God, it's a world of a difference between hearing and seeing. But then there's still level D. That's reserved for Moses. Interacting with God as did Moshe, a seamless connection. This is the level of Vayikra. This is the level of where God calls Moses in that way. Now, just because you might be on level A or level B, maybe some of you are experiencing level C, and I have great respect, and I want to know your tricks. But just because we're on one place of the ladder, it doesn't mean that we're a failure. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. It's part of the journey. And yes, sometimes our experience with God, our experience with spirituality is perhaps nothing more than routine. It's like, okay, it's Passover. I go to a Seder. I mean, where else am I supposed to be? It's Shabbos. I'm going to go to shul. It's whatever it is. I got a new house. I got to put up a mezuzah. What's the question, right? It's part of our life. I mean, okay, it doesn't affect us. I'm a regular human being like all my neighbors around me. I'm not any different. So you might reflect upon yourself and see yourself in this light and say, hey, I'm nowhere on this ladder. I'm right there at the bottom. But the point is not to look so much about where we're holding on the ladder. The point is to see, am I climbing up on the ladder? The point is, we need to always put our best foot forward every day. So back to our original question. We started this lesson by asking, how come we remain unchanged? How come we don't say Manishtana? How come this night is not different than every other night? How come we make resolutions and decisions and we walk out unchanged? How come we don't learn from our mistakes? And certainly we don't learn from the mistakes of others. And the answer is the difference between seeing and hearing. We need to see ourselves. We need to look at our mistakes. It's not just enough to hear about them. So on a very practical level, I'm no self-help guru, but instead of saying I have this and this problem that I need to work on and think about it, write it down on a piece of paper and look at it. And remind yourself, this is what I need to work on. This is the mistake I need to correct. And when we look at it, it's a very humbling experience. It reminds us of who we are and where we're holding. And again, with the caveat, we shouldn't become depressed and say, look how low I am on the ladder. But it's important to have that visual. It's important to see where we're holding. And because like we said earlier, when we see something, it affects us. It makes us change. It makes us have to do something. And inevitably, when we do that, it'll cause us to take responsibility for our actions, to look at our mistakes and say, wow, this is my mistake. This isn't somebody else's. This isn't somebody else's fault. I can't go blame it on somebody else. When I hear my mistakes, when I hear my faults, when I just think about them in my head, then I'm still in my comfort zone. When I have to look in the mirror and see my faults, it's a much more humbling experience. And that's the point where we have to tell ourselves that we have to admit our failure. We have to admit our weakness. And that's part of the message, that the way we move forward, God's telling us that when we study the Torah, we have to be open to change. We have to be open to new perspectives. That's why we have to prepare ourselves 3 days before the giving of the Torah, right? Right now, we're within those 3 days. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, it's not enough to just hear my faults. It's not just enough to hear what I need to work on. I need to look at it. I need to visualize it. I need to, it says when we learn Torah, it's not enough. We don't learn Torah with our feet up on the bench, looking up like this, and let's see what today's Torah portion is. That's not how we learn Torah. We learn Torah bent over a book, peering over the text, meaning we are bringing ourselves closer to the Torah. We don't bring the Torah to us. We don't say, hey, look, I'm comfortable, I'm good. Here I am with the waves crashing in front of me, my feet up. No. We need to be immersed in the Torah. We need to change ourselves. I'll just end up with an anecdote. There was a student who once told his rabbi, he said, Rabbi, ich hab gelernt die ganze Torah. I learned the entire Torah. And to which his rabbi replied, and this really only works in Yiddish because learning and teaching could be the same word. He says, ich hab gelernt die ganze Torah. I learned the whole Torah. His teacher tells him, und was hat die Torah dir gelernt? And what did the Torah teach you? So it's great to learn the Torah. It's great to study it. It's important to absorb the information to hear it. But what is the Torah teaching you? How is it changing you? And that could only happen when we see it, when we use the power of our eyes and we get involved and invested in the Torah that we learn. Then it'll make a change in us. So in summary, to answer the questions that we had, question number one is God offered the Jews a deal to hear the Ten Commandments. Why did the Jews respond with a request to see him? And the answer is that they wanted a closer connection to God, to be impacted in a real way by the experience. Question number two is does one verse describe the Jews as trembling in place, while a later verse depicts them as retreating back in fear? And the answer is because the former is a reaction to hearing God, and the latter is a reaction. The latter reaction is a result of seeing God. The third question, why did the soft and loving kiss of God cause the Jews to tremble so? The answer is it was an awesome experience of drawing close to God, so it overwhelmed them. Infinity and finite human beings inherently cannot relate. And the final question of why did God warn the Jews twice not to ascend the mountain? Because after they were granted the opportunity to see God from a distance, they needed to be warned again, lest they think they could attain the level of Moshe. And so, to change our mistakes and to learn from our mistakes, we have to be able to look at them and humble ourselves enough to internalize our deficiency and be ready to change. Where are we holding?